Okay, let's let's start the recording and talk about income inequality in this class. It is something which has has many branches of economics have something to say about it. And so the previous conversation we had about macroeconomists looking at the entire economy and thinking about what are the causes of income inequality and what are some of the effects, not just the cause. We don't care about just why does it happen, but we care about what's the result of this income inequality. Obviously, one result is that some people have less money and other people have more. That's not a good answer to what's the result of income inequality. You should talk about what are their actual outcomes in some way. In some talk about the efficiency of our economy. Talk about the well-being of the people in that economy and how particularly that could be good or bad for them. So we'll try to do that today. Let's first maybe have a bit of a discussion. Ask you guys, what do you think? I don't know if I want to ask you what the causes are, but I do want to ask you about, why income inequality happens, and also, is it really a big deal? Is this something that we should really care about? Let's talk about economics. Should economists care about income inequality? I mean, what do you guys think about that? Do you have any comments? Is this something we as an economics profession should be concerned with? Is something that we should not be concerned with?
Yes.
Joseph says yes. You think we should be concerned? Maybe this is a philosophical question. Maybe this is a political question. Let the politicians decide what to do about taxes and things like that. Why should economists care? Do you have any further to go on for that?
Yeah, because politicians are bought by corporations. Economists look out more for the general.
Okay, so yeah, that's kind of a cynical view of we have a broken system of politics and therefore we can't trust them. I meant okay, political science. You don't think political scientists are all bought, do you?
No, okay.
That's another academic field.
I think it's more should be for economists, and then political scientists can jump in. But I think it's more an economics thing.
Okay. What do you? Anybody else? What do you think? Is there some conclusions that we can make as economists that would be helpful for, let's say, policy? We don't control policy, but we can speak to those people who do. Economic advisors. Every president has a council of economic advisors, and one in particular that speak to the president, and you actually could have some say over what happens. You also have the Federal Reserve chairman, generally an economist, an academic economist. Right now, the Treasury Secretary, right, Janet Yellen, I think, she is an academic economist. She was for years, she did her own academic research and then sort of shifted into the world of politics. But okay, so I'm sort of agreeing with Joseph now that yes, economists maybe do have something to say and do have a way to even enact some change. So let's talk about it. Anybody else have a comment? Let me show you my slides. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, I guess if you can find a point at which income inequality has negative effects on economic growth, then you would want to look at what policy tools you have at your disposal to mitigate that growth in inequality. And that would have a positive effect on growth if you can show that the increase in inequality has a negative effect.
Okay. So you're already sort of assuming that inequality is a bad thing and that we should do what we can to stop it. Right?
At a point, yeah. I mean, inequality always exists, and too much of anything can be bad.
I wonder if anyone disagrees with that. I wish I can't even reach all these Zoom things are getting in the way of my ability to start my slideshow. That's annoying. Do I have to just wait for it to move?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Isn't it a strong middle class one of the most important things for a healthy economy?
What do you think?
I heard that. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I agree, but do you have any reasons for that?
Spend the spending.
I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. So on the screen now, do you see a full screen income inequality?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just at the top. Okay, this will do. Yeah, Joseph's point is that middle class having income to spend is very important for economic growth. In other words, if you have a lot of income in your country, but that income isn't very well distributed, maybe the income is all going to the top, an oligarchy is a name for, type of government where a few people have all this power and maybe they're all rich. That is actually going to hurt your economic growth, because without a strong middle class having money to spend on goods and services, there won't be businesses that rise up to meet that demand for goods and services, and in generally economic growth will be halted. I think that makes a lot of sense, right? That income inequality, when it becomes too extreme, can actually stunt economic growth. And a lot of people make that argument. Does anybody have a counter argument? Say, that's not really right, because rich people should have more money and then it'll trickle down to others. Does anyone maybe think that? I don't want to I don't want to seem too one-sided here. Let's be honest, it's sort of like a liberal progressive view is to say we should reduce income inequality as much as we can. And then a more conservative, what's the other word? Libertarian, perhaps. Libertarian view would be, just let everyone seek out the opportunities they have. And if it turns out that some people have an opportunity to make a whole lot of money and others don't, that's okay. It all depends on what we do with our lives and what sort of prosperity we enjoy. And it's not the government's place to change that in any significant way. Therefore, income inequality itself is not a bad thing. That's the other side of the view. And so I just don't want the class to be too one-sided where we're like, I want people who maybe believe the other thing to have a chance to say something too. Maybe I'll read Mackenzie's.
Can I say something?
Yeah. Who's talking?
Oh, this is Philip.
How come you're not on the screen?
Uh,
Philip. Oh, maybe it's because your camera's off. That's why
I think
you don't pop up. Okay. I see.
I just wanted. I read an article. I can't remember. I have to find it again. But it essentially said that the current level of income inequality, and I tend to agree with this, is probably a bit too high. But a certain degree of income inequality helps economic growth, which I think in the earlier slide lifts all those. So is it fair to say that some degree of income inequality is helpful to an economy?
Some inequality is helpful?
Yeah, some degree of it. I don't think our current level of it is probably so great,
Yeah.
but like a fair degree of it might be helpful.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if people say that it's actually helpful, but they say that it's okay, that it doesn't hurt. I think the reason, so maybe let me rephrase that argument and see if you agree with me. Income inequality as a natural consequence of the free market is a good thing, because it allows people who are very successful and prosperous to continue to do very well. And that's actually what's good for the economy. It's not that it's good to have poor people. That's not good. Rather, it's that it's good to have an opportunity for income and wealth to grow very, very large, because that incentivizes people to start businesses and take risks and just create some economic activity that will result in their incomes and their wealth being high. I think that's maybe the more accurate representation of the other side, rather than saying income inequality itself is a good thing. It's that an economic environment which leads to economic income inequality naturally is a good thing, rather than something, what's the opposite of that? Something like communism, you might say, where there's very highly regulated wages, and private property is limited in some way, where you can't just get all the money you want and stick it in a bank. There are governments that control this sorts of thing, and the goal in communism is to try to create a more equal society. There would be people who say that is very bad. It's very bad to sort of force equality on society in that way, because no longer do people do what's necessary to prosper in an economic system where they get to keep the benefits of that prosperity. That's the other side.
That's probably a better statement of what I guess I was trying to get at than I guess what I articulated.
Yeah. Here's one thing I have to say about economists is that the mainstream economists are nowhere near that sort of extreme of either end, right? I think we economists are pretty reasonable people on average. Of course, we don't want something like communism or even Marxism. It's very outside the mainstream of economists. You can go to certain universities. I believe the University of Vermont is one of them, where they do have a lot of people who are Marxist. But that's very unusual. Just regular economists sort of believe that it's more efficient to have a decentralized economy. And something about a decentralized economy is going to lead to income inequality. It has to. Why? Because wages are determined by the marginal revenue product of your labor. That's determined by how much human capital you have. It's determined by lots of things. And so you won't find many economists who say what we should do is have zero income inequality. But you do also, they also will say, not so foolish as to say, oh, it's fine to have income inequality to be as extreme as possible. Generally, they don't say that either. Obviously, if there was a king who just took everybody's money and collected it, and the only person who got the money was the king, that would be terrible, because all of the prosperity that could be happening with the middle class just will stop happening. And okay, so I'm sort of arguing now that economists are somewhere in the middle, and that's a good way. That's a good starting point for a discussion like this. Is where in the middle should we be, and what can we do given the situation we find ourselves? Okay. Let me read Mackenzie's comment. She's talked about reducing income inequality could cause externalities. If the rich keep less money, that reduces the incentive to innovate, or something like that. Would you call that an externality? Maybe. Yeah, so this is the worry from economists on the right that says if you redistribute wealth too much, you take away the incentive for innovation, things like that. Okay, that's one concern. I think keep that in mind. But let's talk about what things are like right now. First of all, what counts as income? Not just wages. We want to talk about capital gains too, and profits from the businesses that are owned. And if we're talking about income inequality, all of that's included. This is what I said before. Is it inevitable? I actually think, in my opinion, the answer is yes. Well, I don't know. Do you guys think maybe not? Is income inequality inevitable? Nick's saying yes. Probably most of you are going to agree with me that it is inevitable. Not that we should just let it run rampant and say, okay, Jeff Bezos is going to be a trillionaire and the rest of us are going to have $1,000 each. We don't want that. We don't want Jeff Bezos to have all the money. On the other hand, you could argue that it doesn't really hurt us to have Jeff Bezos become a trillionaire if he does. 20 years from now, 10 years from now, he becomes a trillionaire. Is that going to make us all just miserable human beings? I don't see why. Why, unless you're just a really jealous person, I don't think him having $1 trillion isn't going to like make our lives noticeably worse. And that's not really what we're talking about here. Rather, we want to talk about what's the best way to get more prosperity for everybody. I think that's my comment for that. You could agree with me. Whether or not it's a problem is uncertain, because in 2011 there was a big movement called Occupy Wall Street. They went and sat in a park near outside Wall Street, and they had these demands that they wanted reform to the way our financial system worked, where people who had a lot of money could really easily make more money and grow, and no one was stopping it from just growing larger and larger and larger, while the people who participated in Occupy Wall Street felt that 1% were getting extraordinarily wealthy, while the other 99% were somehow being left behind in the way the financial system was working. And they did believe it was a serious problem that would lead to turmoil and other bad things. Of course, they were part of the turmoil. I'm not sure what actually happened as a result of the Occupy Wall Street. Maybe some people can tell me more about that if they remember. But it was a movement in a very specific moment in time that maybe led to what Bernie Sanders did in the 2016 election. Somebody doesn't realize they're unmuted, I think. I'm going to mute that person. Okay. And, Bernie Sanders came out of nowhere in the 2016 election. He was like, he was polling it at, 3% at one point. And he started talking about income inequality on social media. He got larger and larger, more followers, and he became like a serious challenger for the Democratic nomination in 2016, all because people were ready to hear this argument about income inequality is a problem. Wealth inequality is a problem. Like when I hear Bernie Sanders' voice in my head, I hear the top 10% of the 1% have 99% of the wealth of the top 40. It's always about percentages. You imagine an old guy with a Brooklyn accent talking about percentages. That's how I imagine Bernie Sanders. And he sort of made it cool to talk about percentages because income inequality got to be such a problem. All right. Anything else we want to talk about here? Do we want to disrupt the free market for labor or entrepreneurship? I think maybe this is kind of like what Mackenzie was saying. If you really want to stop inequality, you're really talking about taking money away from people who make a lot and maybe giving some of it to people who don't. That's probably what you're talking about. And that, if you're not careful, could lead to some major disruptions in labor, not just labor, but entrepreneurship. Why should you start a business and make all this money if someone's going to take out? Of course, this is I don't really believe that would happen. Like if people all of a sudden are taxed, they're going to say, well, fine, I'm not going to make any money. People still want money, whether or not some of it is taxed. They still want the money, but there is that argument. We should acknowledge it. Do you remember a Caldor-Hicks improvement? It's when the winners could compensate the losers. Laffer curve, yeah. But remember, even Laffer didn't really believe that this curve would actually happen until you were really high marginal tax rates. He didn't think that this would happen until very high marginal tax rates. And we're not near that yet. And I don't think we will. Let me just ask this question. Caldor-Hicks improvement means the winners could compensate the losers. Do you think wealth redistribution could achieve that? What do you guys think? You understand what I'm asking? Because here's my example. I'll use Jeff Bezos, because for Jeff Bezos, $1,000 is nothing. It really is nothing. It does not affect his life at all. But for the rest of us, $1,000 could be a big deal. In fact, we're getting a coronavirus. I think we're probably going to get another round, and it'll be 1,400 or something. It'll be something that's supposed to help us get through this pandemic. And could that be a Caldor-Hicks improvement? I'm really talking about the extra utility that we get from getting that money versus the loss of utility that Jeff Bezos feels when he loses it, maybe you could argue in some sense that it is an overall improvement in the society as a whole. And of course, I'm not saying therefore we should be communist. I'm saying this is something an economist might say with, is income inequality a problem? Yes, because it's gotten to be so extreme that we're no longer Caldor Hicks efficient. We're giving money, I should say, society is allowing money to generate and income to go to people who don't really need or care about this income. That's the problem, right? That could be solved with maybe some other mechanism. Okay. I don't know if I have anything else to say about this. Oh, I do want us to inheritances. Yeah, very good. Nick says inheritance was also known as the estate tax. You raise the estate tax, then you would be able to control a little bit more this wealth accumulation across generations. If you look at the world's richest people, a list of the world's richest people, like 4 of them are the children of Sam Walton, because he created so much wealth and then bequeathed it to his children. They are now among the world's richest people. And maybe Nick's point is if you just had a stronger inheritance tax or estate tax, then that would say something about the accumulation of wealth across generations. I certainly agree. If that was your goal, you could do that. Let's talk what the Gini coefficient is. The Gini coefficient, also known as the Gini index, it's a number between 0 and 1 that measures how unequal your society is in terms of some measure. Usually it's income, but it doesn't have to be income. It could be wealth. It could be something else. You could have a height Gini coefficient. That wouldn't make any sense, but you could do it. So income inequality can be measured by something called the Gini coefficient. Excuse me. This is something I do want you to know about for the class. One of the things I'm teaching you in this class is, little economic tools that you could use to talk about the policy. Well, here's one tool we could use to talk about a policy. But let me first explain to you how the Gini coefficient is calculated. What you see here if you look at my slides, is a graph with an x-axis and a y-axis. Along the x-axis is the cumulative proportion of the population. So, at 0, we have nobody, and at 100% or 1, we have everybody. What's not said here is that this proportion of the population is ranked in order of incomes. So you should think of people on the right as having the most income, people on the left as having the least income. And then as you start at 0 and move to the right on the x-axis, like when you get to this first dot here, that would be 0.1. That represents the 10% of the population with the lowest income. Now I can't see mine there. And then if you get to this point, which is 0.2, that represents the 20% of the population with the lowest income, lowest 20% income. And here there would be 30%, the bottom 30% of income. This would be bottom 40%, bottom 50, bottom 60, all the way up to all of the population, 100%. So that's what's on the x-axis. And it's just called, here on this graph, it's called cumulative proportion of the population. But you have to remember that it's ranked by income. Okay, what's on the y-axis? Well, it's kind of the same thing, except it's the cumulative proportion of income. This says, of all the income in the society, how much of it is going to this group of people? So like, look at this mark. So this is the 10% mark. This represents 10% of all income in the society, 20% of all income, 30%, all the way up to 100% of all the income in the society. So what do we have? Down here at 0, we have nobody included in this graph. And here at 100, we have everybody included. So of course, at 100, all of the income is generated. So it has to hit this point of 100 and 100, or I should just say 1 and 1. And it has to hit this point of 0 and 0. But everywhere else in the middle, it's going to hit some point which is lower than the green line. The green line represents, if really, I should say, the green line represents perfect equality. Because if everybody had the same income, then the bottom 10% would have 10%. The bottom 20% would have 20% of the income all the way through. It's just a 45-degree line here. Y equals X. That green line represents perfect equality. And I guess what my statement really was is that no society has perfect equality. Even the most communist of all nations, they still have somebody that's running the communism, and that person is going to have more money than the others. Certainly more benefits. Okay. So this red line represents what's actually happening in the country. If we're talking about the United States, okay, this red line could represent, at each point, it represents how much cumulative income the bottom has. So for here, let's take, which one's obvious here? Let's do 20%. According to this red line, the bottom 20% of income earners only have, I would say that's about 5% of the income. See that? At here, X equals 0.2, Y equals 0.05. I mean, it's not precise, but I'm just saying approximately. How about like here at 40? All right. When X equals 0.4, Y seems to be equal to 1.3. I'm sorry, 0.13. And so on. You could do this for the entire population. You could see how much are the people earning. Here's 60%. The bottom 60% of income earners are generating only about 30% of the income of the country, according to this graph. So the lower this graph is, the more unequal the society is. Green represents perfect inequality. The more that it drops below that green line, the more unequal it is. Why? Because these lower income earners aren't earning as much. What about the top income earners? Well, they're earning more because you can, by how steep it gets here, it gets all the way up to this 1 point. And that represents the fact that people with high income have a lot more than the people who have low income. Okay. So this is a really long way of saying this is a measure of income inequality that you can get by the area of the red lens. That's actually how it's measured. You see how this red lens is sort of has some thickness to it. If you think of calculus, it's like the integral of this, the green minus the red over 0 to 1. You don't have to think of it as the integral. But the area is how you should think of it. The area of this red lens divided by, let's say, the largest possible area, which is the area of the red plus the blue together, this triangle, that's called the Gini coefficient. So if I ask you what the Gini coefficient is, I mean, qualitatively, it's a measure of the income inequality of a country or a group of people. But quantitatively, how would you measure it? It's the area of, it's hard to say. It's the area of this lens between perfect inequality and the actual income distribution curve of a country divided by this triangle, which actually is 0.5. I can tell that the triangle is 0.5. It's really just divided by 2. I said divided by 2, I meant times 2. And the Gini coefficient can go down to 0. That would be perfect equality, because that would be if the red line coincided with the green line. The red and green line perfectly overlapped. I should say this, the red line is the reality and the green line is just fixed. So if we lived in a country with perfect equality, these would be totally aligned and the red lens would disappear. Therefore, you'd have 0 divided by 0.5, that would be 0. Perfect equality. What about perfect inequality? That's if nobody in the economy had any income at all except for one guy who had everything. Then this red line would shrink all the way down to the x-axis up until the very end, and then it would shoot up right here to this point. The area of the red part would be equal to the area of the blue part, and that would be 1. So that's how Gini coefficient is calculated. Sorry it took me so long to say, but you guys have any questions about that? You guys think it's dumb? It might be kind of dumb. I'm sorry if I'm teaching you something dumb. It just I have to give you some sort of mathematical way to talk about income inequality. And this seems to be what a lot of people talk about. Okay. That's Gini coefficient. Here, oh, by the way, look at this last thing, Gini index. A lot of times people like to think of things between 0 and 100 instead of 0 and 1. All the Gini indexes take 100 times the Gini coefficient. So it'll range between 0 and 100 instead of 0 and 1. And that's what's graphed here. This is the evolution of the Gini coefficient in the United States for income. It doesn't say this, but it is income. And it's also for households. Do you know why that matters to do households instead of individuals? Especially because things change. The number of women in the workplace has increased drastically since the 1950s. And of course, they did World War II also. But so instead of having those changes be factored in, they just group people by the household, and that's sort of the fairest way to compare what's happening here with income inequality. So what do you see when you look at this graph? Well, one is that it stops at 2009. I do have a continuation on the next slide, but look when things were the worst. Things seem kind of bad now. So first of all, the only range from here is from 38 to 50. So the extreme, it looks a little more extreme than it actually is, but it is still a real change, so we can talk about it. If you think income inequality is bad, then it's been getting worse since 1970. Like clearly this trend line since the 70s is worse and worse. But if somebody tells you it's worse now than it's ever been, I don't really think that's true. It's debatable. And in fact, it's really hard to measure it before this, if you went back to the 1800s, but there was an era where there really was also extremely high income inequality, but it was hard to measure. But ever since it was being measured, this was the Great Depression. So what happened here, 1930, starting 1930s, was the Great Depression. Why does the Great Depression cause so much income inequality? It's because there were no jobs, right? How do you make an income if there are very, very few jobs? Unemployment was really high. A lot of people, and in people who did have jobs, their wages weren't very good. Yet there were some people who did just fine during the Great Depression, right? If you had money, you could use that money to make more money during the Depression. Sometimes, people needed to sell things, and you're like, oh, and they're willing to sell it to you for anything, and you're like, okay, I'll take it. You have a $1,000 piano, but I'll give you $10 for it. And it's like, what? No, I need this piano. Like, well, $10, take it or leave it. It was a time where if you had money, you actually did great. You did well in the Depression. And that's why income inequality was so high. And I think we can all agree that was bad. This was not a good situation for us to be in. We were in a depression and we had a really high income inequality. But go ahead.
Isn't that what happened during the recession with real estate developers? They would buy properties on extremely cheap and then a few years later flipped it for a huge profit? I'm
sure they did. And that just adds to this idea that recessions aren't bad for everybody. Some people actually do very well during recessions. But it does increase the income inequality, as you can see by this graph. It's got like this spike here at 1930. But that's a long time ago. After World War II, it went down. Look how this great. Why do you think things became much more equal from like 1930 to 1970? What do you attribute that to? This is like a history lesson. Geez.
The troops coming back, and then the post-war boom.
Post-war boom. Were you going to say anything, Nick?
Yeah. Well, I guess after the post-war recession, when we started having like the monumental growth that was helped out by the fact that we were the only industrialized nation that hadn't been bombed out to a husk. We were able to implement some really progressive tax policies that made it less advantageous to seek extraordinarily high incomes.
And the middle class grew, right? Somebody said that earlier. The middle class grew tremendously in the 1950s and 60s. That's why we had this decreasing income inequality. It's not really that rich people lost a lot of money. No, it was that the middle class got better and better jobs. And here's another thing. Productivity is something economists use to talk about what is the value of all the goods and services that you produce in a country. That's how productive we are. Sometimes we call it gross domestic product, but generally we call that productivity. When productivity goes up, those are like real gains that the economy gets to enjoy. And the question is, who gets the benefits of those gains? Well, during this reduction here, those benefits were going to workers and other people who got higher incomes because of it. You're producing something more efficiently, therefore you make more money. Where does that profit go to? It was in some sense shared a lot between the capital and the labor components of production. And in fact, there were a lot of unions that enforced that too. Also, there were really strong unions during this time. Something changed in 1970. Something changed where it started to go up. And I'll show you on the next graph that have things gotten any better here? No, it hasn't gotten better. This goes all the way through. The last graph started at 2009. This one goes up to 2019. I don't think they have data for 2020 yet. Even if they don't really have data, you have like a survey, basically, is what you have from the census. The census gives this data. Okay, so let's go back to this graph. Bam. We're gonna have a debate about. Actually, we're gonna have a debate about universal basic income. That's what's gonna happen on Thursday. So why am I talking about income inequality? I think they're related. I think universal basic income is a way to mitigate income inequality, isn't it? It says everyone is going to get an automatic income. And who's going to pay for it? The people with the higher incomes are going to have to pay for it in terms of taxes, but everyone is going to get this income. That's one way to reduce income inequality. Okay, so we're going to have that debate on Thursday, whether, first of all, is it worth doing? Should we do that? And there's another component to it, which is, should we change the current way our welfare system is working? So rather than having benefits that are very need-based, or not need-based, means-tested, if it shifts to more just automatically everybody gets basic income, we'll have that debate on Thursday. And I would like you all to write a summary of your opinion of that as homework, as usual. Okay, I'm sorry, where was I? Is this dumb? We're talking about history right now. I was born in 1980, so right here, when I was born, the Gini index was like 40, and now it's almost 50. It's 49 here, 48. Okay, so in my lifetime, we've seen a drastic increase in the inequality. Remember, up on this graph is inequality, down on this graph is more equality. You can tell the person here who highlighted the Reagan-Bush era, I think they were making some kind of commentary on like the taxes and the other sort of trickle-down economics that was popular in the era of Ronald Reagan, which was to say, we should let rich people have more of their money because they are going to invest it in businesses, and that prosperity will trickle down to everybody else. That was called trickle-down economics. What was the result of all of that trickle down? It didn't really trickle down. It didn't trickle down to lower income people, because look how much worse income inequality got. Well, maybe some of it trickled down. I don't know. I'm not an expert in that. But now I want this lecture to be about what caused this income inequality. Let's forget about before 1970, because we know something about that recession and Great Depression and post-war boom with the middle class. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't know. But maybe you're not an American. Somebody here is an international student, and I think they have at least one international student here. And I apologize to, I believe it's a woman. I apologize to her for speaking so much about American history, but I am right now, and I'm guilty of this very, very, very American-centric class that I'm teaching right now. And if you aren't familiar with the history of our country, some of this is going to seem kind of pointless, but hopefully you can just kind of bear with me and think about what are the economics of what's happening here. And in fact, I'm telling you about the history so that the economics makes more sense. Where are we now? Let's talk about the increase in inequality since 1970. Do you have any ideas why? Other than what I just said about Reagan and Bush, which is they had this idea, you just let rich people keep more of their money and it will help everybody. Forget about that. What else may have caused it? The increase in inequality. Any ideas?
Didn't interest rates spike during the late 70s?
They did.
Mid 80s, which
They
would
did.
mean you'd get more gains from capital.
Interesting. Well, okay. You get more gains from capital. Oh, think about that. Is that true in real terms, though? Because there was inflation, right?
I mean, I guess
It wasn't just that interest rates were really high, but inflation wasn't high. They were both high.
if wage growth didn't keep up with the gains from capital, then that would cause an increase in inequality, right?
Yes. Yes. In fact, that's kind of it. Although Nick went further to talk about like the interest rate and gains from capital. And you've read the Thomas Piketty book, Capital, or maybe you haven't. I thought you said you had. Yeah. Okay. So that book goes into a lot of detail about what he just said as the gains from capital, meaning that if you hear capital, you should just think of as money. You have a bunch of money. Congratulations, you have $1 billion. What are you going to do with your $1 billion? You're going to invest it. You find something to do with your $1 billion. Well, what if the rate of growth for that $1 billion is really high? That means you, a rich person, is going to get extraordinarily, not just will you have a high wealth, but you'll have a high income in the form of capital gains from that. And this is the argument of Thomas Piketty that once a society gets these really high gains from capital and the gains from wage, the productivity that goes to wages doesn't range, that causes a lot of turmoil. And in fact, it could be very hazardous for society, I think. Is that the conclusion? Am I doing him justice by describing that book?
More or less, yeah. He calls it the fundamental inequality, where the return from capital is higher than the growth rate of economies in the long run.
But it's a cautionary tale, right? That we should not allow the returns from capital to be so high that it sort of changes the way the economy runs in a negative way. I think maybe he doesn't say that.
That's definitely one of his biggest conclusions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's it. That's one of the reasons. Maybe that's the biggest one. And we have a chat. Somebody had a chat. I can't see your chat. Charlotte says, could the increased cost of healthcare and education be a cause of income inequality? Ooh, interesting. I definitely think healthcare and education are factors. I don't think purely the cost of those are going to be a big factor, because remember, we're talking about income now. We're not talking about wealth. So unless you think that the opportunity to make an income is somehow hindered for one group over another, and that's possible. I will actually ask you to read a paper that's about intergenerational mobility, which says something about mostly wealth gaps. But what Charlotte said actually does apply a lot to that. The author of that piece is called Miles Korak, and he comes to this conclusion that there is a lot of lack of intergenerational mobility, where your parents are poor, so you're poor. Your parents are rich, so you're rich. That involves no mobility. But if you're poor, if your parents are poor, but you have some chance of becoming rich, that's mobility. And in the United States, compared to other countries, we actually have worse mobility. not so good in this country. And then he talked about the reasons for that, and not so much healthcare, but education and the really high cost of education in this country and the returns from education, he argues, are a big part of that. So you can look at that article on Blackboard. It's under readings, I guess. It's under course documents, readings. Maybe it's not under readings, just in the course documents, but it's called Intergenerational Mobility. And that's the only reading we have for this section. So yeah, thanks for leading that. Let me go to my slides, what I say about it. Here's some causes of the increase in income inequality. And of course, these are not all of them. I'm just doing some. What have I written here? Since 1980 in particular, gains in productivity no longer correspond to gains in wages. I think Nick was saying that a little bit. What do I mean by that? The gains, the fact that you become more productive. You know, you were a factory, it was formerly you were producing 100 widgets, and now you can produce 1,000 widgets. Isn't that great? You just became so much more productive. Who gets the benefit of that? Who actually gets paid based on that increase in productivity? Well, before 1980, the workers got it. The workers used to be making $1 per hour, but once you start getting more efficient at making widgets, then their wages went up to $10 per hour, right? They saw the gains of that productivity. But after 1980, they didn't get any, practically. I mean, I'm speaking in extremes, but it would be like, well, okay, your factory produces 10 times as many widgets, but your wages are exactly the same. That happened. Something changed that caused that. We can talk about that, why that is, but it is. In fact, let me go to this. I'm going to go to this slide. Here's the slide that, I think is important, and probably a lot of you maybe have even seen before. The dark blue represents the gains in productivity in our economy since 1948. That's a good place to start because it's post-World War. After that, there were no world wars after 1948, so that's a good place to start. The dark blue line represents the fact that our economy became more and more productive pretty consistently between then and now. And what's the light blue line? That's the hourly compensation. So this includes wages or salaries. You take the total amount of work people are doing, and also benefits too, wages and benefits, and plot how those go up. You can see how closely aligned they are. They're like right on top of each other up until here. Something happens. I know what happened. I was born. In my lifetime, they just like split up. What? Where these become pretty much flat and the dark blue becomes higher. So this seems like an issue that economists should care about too, because we think about the economy and how it grows and how wages are tied to economic growth is important. And, it's not my area of specialty, but a lot of people are focused on this. Why is there this gap? And they have a lot of reasons, and they've done a lot of economic research to sort of explain that and think about ways to maybe help improve wages somehow. But let's talk about. In this class, let's treat it as it's a fact. It happened. But by the way, does everyone understand what this graph is showing you? X-axis is the year. Y-axis is the percent increase in either in productivity or in wages. They're both plotted, even though, this is like 50%, 100%, 150, 200% increase relative to 1948. Okay, no one had any questions. Yeah, so that's weird. How much time do I want to spend on this? How much time do you guys want to spend on this? Should we talk about the causes of income inequality or not? Maybe you have some thoughts. If you do, say them. But I wrote these down. Something that happened in the 70s is globalization really started to take off. This idea that you could sell your product anywhere in the world. You could have a factory in another country, build something and bring it to this country to sell it. That, in a lot of ways, was great for our society because you have a larger market, you have more profits, you have more ways of producing things that previously were not possible. Generally, economists think that's great. Globalization, hooray. It really created a larger labor supply, though. Now we think about supply and demand of labor. If the labor supply curve just keeps getting bigger and bigger, shifting to the right, but the labor demand curve doesn't shift to the right nearly as fast. And you can come up with a lot of reasons why that's true. The United States has a big economy, but not like billions of people, whereas the rest of the world does have billions of people. The labor supply just grew much faster than the labor demand. That is, let's go to this graph. That's, you could argue, is a big reason why the hourly compensation stayed low since the 70s. Yeah. I like this point too, that sometimes just the threat of outsourcing, it undermines the domestic labor bargaining position. So let's say before 1970, you could form a union and say, we want an increase in wages, otherwise we're going to go on strike. Well, once globalization happens, if you're the owner of a business like that, and you say, oh yeah, you're going to go on strike? Fine, I'll just outsource to some other country. And the union knows that. The union knows that they just don't have the bargaining position they used to have. And therefore, they cannot use collective bargaining to get increases in wages. Once globalization happens, their bargaining tools are just removed. And I think that's a big reason why this is flat. One of many. Did somebody have a point? There's a chat. Nixon. Yeah, I think so. Well, so Philip, you're focusing on China here, but it wasn't just China, right? We had increased globalization pretty steadily starting in the 1970s. By globalization, I mean you can form transnational corporations. You could just import and export things much more easily. But of course,
focusing on more of China as an example.
Oh, sure. Okay. And of course,
You're
China,
asking about what happened in the 1970s. Well, as an example, I should have said as an example, but as an example, we opened up trade with China, who has really cheap labor.
Yeah. I happen to know something that, like the case with China, my wife actually lived in China in the early 1980s. She's an American, but her parents brought her as a child to live in China. And actually, it was not very conducive to economic growth at the time. It was still it's a communist country, and it's still a communist country, but in the 70s and 80s, they didn't have the sort of market reforms that allowed them to earn profits, and for foreign companies like American countries to actually come to China and hire Chinese people to build things. That didn't really start happening until the 90s. And once it did, man, China's economy took off. But before that, like in the 1980s, China was a very poor country. 70s and 80s, most of their workers just didn't have a good way to make the jobs in communist China back then. So yes, it is true. Nixon opened up trade with China, but there wasn't this sort of, when you're talking about the labor in China being cheaper, where you have a factory in China. I think most of that started later because the government of China realized, even though they're communists, they still want the benefit of some of these decentralized markets, and they changed their economy in order to incentivize more businesses to come to China so that they could keep those profits. Yeah, good comment though. I just want to talk about a few more of these and then we can be done. It's already 3. Well, I want to talk about universal basic income. Do you guys agree with this thing, winner take all profits? That's part of why we have this income inequality. If you think about Walmart, it's a place where they have just ridiculously low average costs. They got to be such a big company, they can do things at lower cost than other retailers. And they sort of put the ma and pa businesses out of business. And if you're an owner in Walmart, this is great for you. the stocks are rising, and all these profits that Walmart is making are going to you. It's a winner take all. Whereas the other businesses are like, well, sorry, you're not good enough to compete with Walmart, and you disappear. And that started to happen more. And when I say network economies, I mean companies like Microsoft in particular. They grow larger and larger because people want to use their products in order to be able to be compatible with everyone else. Everyone else is using Microsoft, so I have to, or Apple or Facebook. Maybe that's not such a big deal. There was definitely some deregulation of financial markets, especially in the 80s. And this allowed people who have money to make more of it. That's really what happened. When you have a financial system that has little regulation, people are going to find ways, for example, to use leveraging in order to take a little bit of money and grow it enormously. And that helped to cause income inequality. Paul Krugman is a Nobel Prize winning economist, and he summed it up. The reason for income inequality is that cutting wages, crushing unions, and financial wheeling dealing, that's what he calls it. But, believe him if you want. The effects of income inequality. What has it done to us? Well, we already talked about this. You guys were pretty quick to talk about this, that wealthy are less likely to spend money. So if more of our money is going to the rich and less to the middle class, that could actually have less economic growth because of that. Less income mobility, that can happen too, where it's not even possible for people who have low income to reach the top. Why? Because they're poor, and being poor causes problems that you have to deal with. You don't even have an opportunity to go to college and get a great job, or you're just so busy trying to keep your head above water that you don't have time to grow your wealth and succeed that way. Another thing that could happen because of income inequality is borrowing, in the sense that when people have unequal incomes or unequal wealth, if your expenditure, somehow relative expenditure, is what matters, that means people who have less money have to borrow money just to keep up with the Joneses. That's an expression that means, I don't know if I have a good economic example of this, but phone technology or something, where if you don't have a good phone, you're just not able to perform at your job, and everyone else has these good phones, so I guess you have to buy one too. Or I don't know. Health outcomes could depend on relative income, not absolute. So actually, if you think of a healthcare system where just people with more money have more access, and they can get the MRIs, they can get the best treatments that are available. And people who don't have money, they just, it's not about how much absolute money they have. It's about the relative incomes, that there's going to be people who can get access to the healthcare and some people who don't. If that would be a negative effect of income inequality, if it's true. Okay. I've talked about causes, I've talked about effects. There was going to be something I said about, I could talk about this, how the US compares to other countries. Here's my way of summing it up. Income inequality in the US is high. It's a bit high, but it's pretty comparable to other major developed countries if you don't think about taxes and transfers. Taxes and then transfers would be like, you get a benefit from the government. Here's the US is sitting there about 48 or 49. In other countries, Italy's high, Germany's high. These are the G8 countries, the ones with large economies and mostly democratic, although Russia is now out of it. So I think it's G7 now, not G8. But, okay, so the US is normal income inequality before transfers, but after transfers, the US is among the highest among similar well-developed countries. This is saying even if you factor in taxation and any benefits you get from the government, like Italy, which was more unequal than us before, they become more equal because of their tax rate. And we sort of stand out, I think, as a particularly unequal country after transfers. Okay. No time for that or that or that. Let's talk about universal basic income, and because you have to write about it, and we don't need that. We can talk about it, just us. What does universal basic income do? It literally just everyone in the country gets a check from the government for $1,000 every month. Do we know who's debating it on Thursday? I forget. Are you here?
I am.
Peter and Mihak?
I am doing the 4.
Mihak is going to be for, and Peter is going to be against. And the rest of you are going to write about it to me for homework. So what we're debating is, can we use the $1,000 per month? Is that okay, Mihak? If that's like the standard, or do you want it to be something else?
Yeah, it sounds fine for now.
Okay. Are you familiar with Andrew Yang?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I read about him.
Okay, well, so he spoke about. I'm kind of a nerd. I watched all the debates from the presidential election, and Andrew Yang, every single debate, he found a way to talk about this. To say, you asked him about Middle East wars, and somehow he would pivot back to this. His main point that he wanted you to know about him is that he supported a freedom dividend of $1,000 per month given to absolutely everybody in the country. Although, did he say, I don't know if he said about people who are not citizens. I think maybe you have to be a citizen. Is that correct? Do you happen to know, Mihak?
I'm not really sure about
Not
that.
sure. Peter, do you happen to know? Should people who are not citizens get the money according to this UBI?
I don't know off the top of
Yeah.
my head.
So for this class, why don't we say it does not apply to citizens? Well, so if you're a permanent resident but not a citizen, let's just say for the purposes of the debate on Thursday and for your summary on Thursday, let's say that person does not get the income. You have to be a citizen of this country. Of course, you could become a citizen. There is a way for people to become citizens, and once they do, then they would get the UBI. But you're going to talk about the arguments for this. You could talk about how this will help reduce income inequality, right? You could think about the freedom it might. So he calls it the freedom dividend, in the sense where it actually means you're more able to leave your job, aren't you, and search for another job. Think about how this might affect the job market and the matching market. That if you're somebody who is stuck at a job that you hate, you might feel like you have to keep this job, because if you don't, you're going to run out of money and your life will be really bad. Whereas if you have this UBI, it gives you some time to say, well, I really don't like my job. I'm going to take this time to search for a better one. Or maybe I'll go to school and get an education that will help me get a better job. Or just somehow I want to match myself with an employer that's better than the one I currently have. And that's one reason you could argue, right? I'm giving you reasons. Paula, is that
Professor?
you? Yeah.
I was going to say this earlier, but yeah, could you also argue that without income inequality, there would be less competition, and then that would lead to a less efficient economy?
Less competition for what?
Well, because I remember a point you were talking about earlier, where you were saying that if the wealth was distributed evenly among people, that's essentially taking away money from the rich,
Oh,
and then I'm kind of getting it from there.
yeah. So my answer is it depends on how you would enforce that. If you would enforce perfect equality by saying any money you make over the average is going to be taken from you and given to somebody else, then yes, I agree. It reduces, I wouldn't say it reduces competition, but it reduces the gains from competing with and succeeding in the market.
Okay.
And of course, that would be probably a bad thing. I think what we're talking about now, though, is given the income inequality, would it be better to reduce it some way? And not in some sort of strict totalitarian way where, the government will take all of your money and decide what to do with it. Nobody's suggesting that. We're gonna take a middle ground here that says, should we have a tax that could be pretty big, especially on high income people, that will pay for a universal income. Everyone gets it. And that would reduce the amount of income inequality in this country, I think. There would still be a lot of income inequality. It would just reduce it somewhat. We also should talk about the fact that there are a lot of benefits from the government, like Medicaid and Social Security, and I was come up with a blank when I started talking about these, but there are other benefits, and perhaps UBI could be a replacement for those. And so maybe for the debate, we're going to talk about whether we should keep the welfare system the way we currently have it, or we should sort of radically change it to this universal basic income that says you don't have to apply for this income, you just get it automatically. That's one thing we talk about. So Peter is going to be against it, and I guess you're going to want to talk about, well, maybe some of the bad things of taxation. I'm guessing, right? That it's just like, who's going to pay for it, right? You could argue, sure, UBI sounds great, but ultimately, how are we going to pay for it? Is it going to increase the debt? Because the reality is politicians love to increase the spending for the programs they care about, but nobody likes to raise taxes. I don't even think Democrats like to raise taxes, but it's unpopular, I should say that. So that's one strike against it. You could also say that we have these means-tested programs for a reason. That we have Medicaid that only low-income people get for a reason, because people who have more money don't need it. What else could you say? I don't know. I don't want to give you all your arguments, but money above UBI with the checks only going to be below UBI level. I think, Nick, the answer is everyone. Even though I agree with you that it's sort of foolish, because you're gonna have some people who's are paying into the system and they're getting money back, and it's exactly the same. You know what I mean? And you could argue that why bother that? They should just have a cutoff where, or maybe it's tapered. You could imagine it sort of tapering down where the amount of money. But see, once again, though, you start getting into, let's say you do make it tapered. Already you get to this idea where the more you make, the less you get from UBI, and that could somehow change your incentives. Whereas I don't think that's what Andrew Yang had in mind. I think he had in mind, everybody gets this money. Even if you get a job, you start making more money, you still get your UBI, right? So you still have the incentive to make more money. Whereas if you have a program, go ahead.
I was just saying that I'm not really sure about Andrew Yang, like how he posed it, but I did some research on how other countries did it, especially Canada, and there are some European countries who try to implement some sort of UBI in specific areas, and the result was it's usually like it was firstly implemented only for a certain group of people, just like Nick said, Nick pointed out. And the result was generally positive, and also it usually works more on, I know I'm going against myself right now, but it usually works on people who are like poor or not have like good income.
Yeah, well, by works on, you mean it benefits them, it helps their life. Yeah,
it's generally benefits.
First of all, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
Why do you have a UBI? It's to help people. And the argument is, let's just give it to everybody rather than only certain people, because we want you to have this benefit and still be incentivized to make more money if you can. why don't we stop here? I think you guys have enough to write about on Thursday, and the two of you who are debating, hopefully do some more research. I would love it if you could bring in some case studies, like Mihak, you've already thought about places where they've tried it before. Why don't you tell us how it happened? You know, how successful it was. That'd be nice to hear about. Anybody else have any questions? I'm still recording. I'm gonna stop recording somehow.